Chapter 16 of Agnes Grey by Anne Brontë. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 16. The Substitution.
Next Sunday was one of the gloomiest of April days, a day of thick dark clouds and heavy showers. None of the Murrays were disposed to attend church in the afternoon, excepting Rosalie. She was bent upon going as usual, so she ordered the carriage, and I went with her. Nothing loth, of course, for at church I might look without fear of scorn or censure upon a form and face more pleasing to me than the most beautiful of God's creations. I might listen without disturbance to a voice more charming than the sweetest music to my ears. I might seem to hold communion with that soul, in which I felt so deeply interested, and imbibe its purest thoughts and holiest aspirations, with no alloy to such felicity except the secret reproaches of my conscience, which would too often whisper that I was deceiving my own self, and mocking God with the service of a heart more bent upon the creature than the Creator. Sometimes such thoughts would give me trouble enough, but sometimes I could quiet them with thinking, it is not the man, it is his goodness that I love. Whatsoever things are pure, whatsoever things are lovely, whatsoever things are honest and of good report, think on these things. We do well to worship God in his works, and I know none of them in which so many of his attributes, so much of his own spirit shines, as in this his faithful servant, whom to know and not to appreciate were obtuse insensibility in me, who have so little else to occupy my heart. Almost immediately after the conclusion of the service, Miss Murray left the church. We had to stand in the porch, for it was raining, and the carriage was not yet come. I wondered at her coming forth so hastily, for neither young Meltham nor Squire Green was there, but I soon found it was to secure an interview with Mr. Weston as he came out, which he presently did. Having saluted us both, he would have passed on, but she detained him, first with observations upon the disagreeable weather, and then with asking if he would be so kind as to come some time to-morrow to see the granddaughter of the old woman who kept the porter's lodge, for the girl was ill of a fever, and wished to see him. He promised to do so.
"And at what time will you be most likely to come, Mr. Weston? The old woman will like to know when to expect you. You know such people think more about having their cottages in order when decent people come to see them than we are apt to suppose."
Here was a wonderful instance of consideration from the thoughtless Miss Murray. Mr. Weston named an hour in the morning at which he would endeavour to be there. By this time the carriage was ready, and the footman was waiting, with an open umbrella, to escort Miss Murray through the churchyard. I was about to follow, but Mr. Weston had an umbrella too, and offered me the benefit of its shelter, for it was raining heavily. "No, thank you, I don't mind the rain," I said. I always lacked common sense when taken by surprise.
"But you don't like it, I suppose? An umbrella will do you no harm at any rate,"
he replied, with a smile that showed he was not offended, as a man of worse temper or less penetration would have been at such a refusal of his aid. I could not deny the truth of his assertion, and so went with him to the carriage. He even offered me his hand on getting in, an unnecessary piece of civility, but I accepted that too, for fear of giving offence. One glance he gave, one little smile at parting. It was but for a moment, but therein I read, or thought I read, a meaning that kindled in my heart a brighter flame of hope than had ever yet arisen.
"I would have sent the footman back for you, Miss Grey, if you'd waited a moment. You needn't have taken Mr. Weston's umbrella,"
observed Rosalie, with a very unamiable cloud upon her pretty face. I would have come without an umbrella, but Mr. Weston offered me the benefit of his, and I could not have refused it more than I did without offending him, replied I, smiling placidly, for my inward happiness made that amusing which would have wounded me at another time. The carriage was now in motion. Miss Murray bent forwards, and looked out of the window as we were passing Mr. Weston. He was pacing homewards along the causeway, and did not turn his head.
"Stupid ass!"
cried she, throwing herself back again in the seat.
"You don't know what you've lost by not looking this way."
"What has he lost?"
"A bow from me that would have raised him to the seventh heaven."
I made no answer. I saw she was out of humour, and I derived a secret gratification from the fact, not that she was vexed, but that she thought she had reason to be so. It made me think my hopes were not entirely the offspring of my wishes and imagination.
"I mean to take up Mr. Weston instead of Mr. Hatfield,"
said my companion, after a short pause, resuming something of her usual cheerfulness.
The ball at Ashby Park takes place on Tuesday, you know, and mamma thinks it very likely that Sir Thomas will propose to me then. Such things are often done in the privacy of the ball-room, when gentlemen are most easily ensnared and ladies most enchanting. But if I am to be married so soon, I must make the best of the present time. I am determined Hatfield shall not be the only man who shall lay his heart at my feet, and implore me to accept the worthless gift in vain.
"If you mean Mr. Weston to be one of your victims," said I, with affected indifference, "you will have to make such overtures yourself that you will find it difficult to draw back when he asks you to fulfil the expectations you have raised."
I don't suppose he will ask me to marry him, nor should I desire it. That would be rather too much presumption. But I intend him to feel my power. He has felt it already, indeed, but he shall acknowledge it too. And what visionary hopes he may have he must keep to himself, and only amuse me with the result of them, for a time.
"Oh, that some kind spirit would whisper those words in his ear!" I inwardly exclaimed. I was far too indignant to hazard a reply to her observation aloud, and nothing more was said about Mr. Weston that day, by me or in my hearing. But next morning, soon after breakfast, Miss Murray came into the schoolroom, where her sister was employed at her studies, or rather her lessons, for studies they were not, and said,
"Matilda, I want you to take a walk with me about 11 o'clock.
"Oh, I can't, Rosalie. I have to give orders about my new bridle and saddle-cloth, and speak to the rat-catcher about his dogs. Miss Grey must go with you."
"No, I want you,"
said Rosalie, and calling her sister to the window, she whispered an explanation in her ear, upon which the latter consented to go. I remembered that 11 was the hour at which Mr. Weston proposed to come to the porter's lodge, and remembering that, I beheld the whole contrivance. Accordingly, at dinner, I was entertained with a long account of how Mr. Weston had overtaken them as they were walking along the road, and how they had had a long walk and talk with him, and really found him quite an agreeable companion, and how he must have been, and evidently was, delighted with them and their amazing condescension, etc., etc.
End of chapter 16. Of Agnes Grey by Anne Brontë. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 17. Confessions.
As I am in the way of confessions, I may as well acknowledge that, about this time, I paid more attention to dress than ever I had done before. This is not saying much, for hitherto I had been a little neglectful in that particular, but now, also, it was no uncommon thing to spend as much as 2 minutes in the contemplation of my own image in the glass, though I never could derive any consolation from such a study. I could discover no beauty in those marked features, that pale hollow cheek, and ordinary dark brown hair. There might be intellect in the forehead, there might be expression in the dark grey eyes, but what of that? A low Grecian brow, and large black eyes devoid of sentiment, would be esteemed far preferable. It is foolish to wish for beauty. Sensible people never either desire it for themselves, or care about it in others. If the mind be but well cultivated, and the heart well disposed, no one ever cares for the exterior. So said the teachers of our childhood, and so say we to the children of the present day. All very judicious and proper, no doubt, but are such assertions supported by actual experience? We are naturally disposed to love what gives us pleasure, and what more pleasing than a beautiful face, when we know no harm of the possessor at least? A little girl loves her bird. Why? Because it lives and feels, because it is helpless and harmless? A toad likewise lives and feels, and is equally helpless and harmless. But though she would not hurt a toad, she cannot love it like the bird, with its graceful form, soft feathers, and bright speaking eyes. If a woman is fair and amiable, she is praised for both qualities, but especially the former, by the bulk of mankind. If, on the other hand, she is disagreeable in person and character, her plainness is commonly inveighed against as her greatest crime, because, to common observers, it gives the greatest offence; while, if she is plain and good, provided she is a person of retired manners and secluded life, no one ever knows of her goodness, except her immediate connections. Others, on the contrary, are disposed to form unfavourable opinions of her mind and disposition, if it be but to excuse themselves for their instinctive dislike of one so unfavoured by nature, and vice versa with her whose angel form conceals a vicious heart, or sheds a false deceitful charm over defects and foibles that would not be tolerated in another. They that have beauty, let them be thankful for it, and make a good use of it, like any other talent. They that have it not, let them console themselves, and do the best they can without it. Certainly, though liable to be overestimated, it is a gift of God, and not to be despised. Many will feel this who have felt that they could love, and whose hearts tell them that they are worthy to be loved again, while yet they are debarred, by the lack of this, or some such seeming trifle, from giving and receiving that happiness they seem almost made to feel and to impart. As well might the humble glowworm despise that power of giving light, without which the roving fly might pass her and repass her 1,000 times, and never rest beside her. She might hear her winged darling buzzing over and around her, he vainly seeking her, she longing to be found, but with no power to make her presence known, no voice to call him, no wings to follow his flight. The fly must seek another mate, the worm must live and die alone. Such were some of my reflections about this period. I might go on prosing more and more. I might dive much deeper, and disclose other thoughts, propose questions the reader might be puzzled to answer, and deduce arguments that might startle his prejudices, or, perhaps, provoke his ridicule, because he could not comprehend them, but I forbear. Now, therefore, let us return to Miss Murray. She accompanied her mamma to the ball on Tuesday, of course splendidly attired, and delighted with her prospects and her charms. As Ashby Park was nearly 10 miles distant from Horton Lodge, they had to set out pretty early, and I intended to have spent the evening with Nancy Brown, whom I had not seen for a long time, but my kind pupil took care I should spend it neither there nor anywhere else beyond the limits of the schoolroom, by giving me a piece of music to copy, which kept me closely occupied till bedtime. About 11 next morning, as soon as she had left her room, she came to tell me her news. Sir Thomas had indeed proposed to her at the ball, an event which reflected great credit on her mamma's sagacity, if not upon her skill in contrivance. I rather inclined to the belief that she had first laid her plans, and then predicted their success. The offer had been accepted, of course, and the bridegroom-elect was coming that day to settle matters with Mr. Murray. Rosalie was pleased with the thoughts of becoming mistress of Ashby Park. She was elated with the prospect of the bridal ceremony, and its attendant splendour and éclat, the honeymoon spent abroad, and the subsequent gaieties she expected to enjoy in London and elsewhere. She appeared pretty well pleased, too, for the time being, with Sir Thomas himself, because she had so lately seen him, danced with him, and been flattered by him. But after all, she seemed to shrink from the idea of being so soon united. She wished the ceremony to be delayed some months at least, and I wished it too. It seemed a horrible thing to hurry on the inauspicious match, and not to give the poor creature time to think and reason on the irrevocable step she was about to take. I made no pretension to a mother's watchful, anxious care, but I was amazed and horrified at Mrs. Murray's heartlessness, or want of thought for the real good of her child, and by my unheeded warnings and exhortations I vainly strove to remedy the evil. Miss Murray only laughed at what I said, and I soon found that her reluctance to an immediate union arose chiefly from a desire to do what execution she could among the young gentlemen of her acquaintance, before she was incapacitated from further mischief of the kind. It was for this cause that, before confiding to me the secret of her engagement, she had extracted a promise that I would not mention a word on the subject to any one. And when I saw this, and when I beheld her plunge more recklessly than ever into the depths of heartless coquetry, I had no more pity for her. Come what will, I thought, she deserves it. Sir Thomas cannot be too bad for her, and the sooner she is incapacitated from deceiving and injuring others, the better. The wedding was fixed for the 1st of June. Between that and the critical ball was little more than 6 weeks. But, with Rosalie's accomplished skill and resolute exertion, much might be done, even within that period, especially as Sir Thomas spent most of the interim in London, whither he went up, it was said, to settle affairs with his lawyer, and make other preparations for the approaching nuptials. He endeavoured to supply the want of his presence by a pretty constant fire of billet-doux, but these did not attract the neighbours' attention, and open their eyes, as personal visits would have done, and old Lady Ashby's haughty, sour spirit of reserve withheld her from spreading the news, while her indifferent health prevented her coming to visit her future daughter-in-law, so that altogether this affair was kept far closer than such things usually are. Rosalie would sometimes show her lover's epistles to me, to convince me what a kind, devoted husband he would make. She showed me the letters of another individual too, the unfortunate Mr. Green, who had not the courage, or, as she expressed it, the spunk, to plead his cause in person, but whom one denial would not satisfy. He must write again and again. He would not have done so if he could have seen the grimaces his fair idol made over his moving appeals to her feelings, and heard her scornful laughter, and the opprobrious epithets she heaped upon him for his perseverance. "Why don't you tell him at once that you are engaged?" I asked.
"Oh, I don't want him to know that,"
replied she.
"If he knew it, his sisters and everybody would know it, and then there would be an end of my ahem. And besides, if I told him that, he would think my engagement was the only obstacle, and that I would have him if I were free, which I could not bear that any man should think, and he of all others at least. Besides, I don't care for his letters,"
she added contemptuously.
"He may write as often as he pleases, and look as great a calf as he likes when I meet him. It only amuses me."
Meantime, young Meltham was pretty frequent in his visits to the house, or transits past it, and judging by Matilda's execrations and reproaches, her sister paid more attention to him than civility required. In other words, she carried on as animated a flirtation as the presence of her parents would admit. She made some attempts to bring Mr. Hatfield once more to her feet, but finding them unsuccessful, she repaid his haughty indifference with still loftier scorn, and spoke of him with as much disdain and detestation as she had formerly done of his curate. But, amid all this, she never for a moment lost sight of Mr. Weston. She embraced every opportunity of meeting him, tried every art to fascinate him, and pursued him with as much perseverance as if she really loved him and no other, and the happiness of her life depended upon eliciting a return of affection. Such conduct was completely beyond my comprehension. Had I seen it depicted in a novel, I should have thought it unnatural. Had I heard it described by others, I should have deemed it a mistake, or an exaggeration. But when I saw it with my own eyes, and suffered from it too, I could only conclude that excessive vanity, like drunkenness, hardens the heart, enslaves the faculties, and perverts the feelings, and that dogs are not the only creatures which, when gorged to the throat, will yet gloat over what they cannot devour, and grudge the smallest morsel to a starving brother. She now became extremely beneficent to the poor cottagers. Her acquaintance among them was more widely extended. Her visits to their humble dwellings were more frequent and excursive than they had ever been before. Hereby she earned among them the reputation of a condescending and very charitable young lady, and their encomiums were sure to be repeated to Mr. Weston, whom also she had thus a daily chance of meeting in one or other of their abodes, or in her transits to and fro, and often likewise she could gather, through their gossip, to what places he was likely to go at such and such a time, whether to baptize a child, or to visit the aged, the sick, the sad, or the dying, and most skilfully she laid her plans accordingly. In these excursions she would sometimes go with her sister, whom, by some means, she had persuaded or bribed to enter into her schemes, sometimes alone, never now with me, so that I was debarred the pleasure of seeing Mr. Weston, or hearing his voice even in conversation with another, which would certainly have been a very great pleasure, however hurtful or however fraught with pain. I could not even see him at church, for Miss Murray, under some trivial pretext, chose to take possession of that corner in the family pew which had been mine ever since I came, and unless I had the presumption to station myself between Mr. and Mrs. Murray, I must sit with my back to the pulpit, which I accordingly did. Now, also, I never walked home with my pupils. They said their mamma thought it did not look well to see 3 people out of the family walking, and only 2 going in the carriage; and as they greatly preferred walking in fine weather, I should be honoured by going with the seniors.
"And besides,"
said they,
"you can't walk as fast as we do."
"You know you're always lagging behind."
I knew these were false excuses, but I made no objections, and never contradicted such assertions, well knowing the motives which dictated them. And in the afternoons, during those 6 memorable weeks, I never went to church at all. If I had a cold, or any slight indisposition, they took advantage of that to make me stay at home, and often they would tell me they were not going again that day themselves, and then pretend to change their minds, and set off without telling me, so managing their departure that I never discovered the change of purpose till too late. Upon their return home, on one of these occasions, they entertained me with an animated account of a conversation they had had with Mr. Weston as they came along.
"And he asked if you were ill, Miss Grey,"
said Matilda.
"but we told him you were quite well, only you didn't want to come to church, so he'll think you're turned wicked."
All chance meetings on week-days were likewise carefully prevented, for, lest I should go to see poor Nancy Brown, or any other person, Miss Murray took good care to provide sufficient employment for all my leisure hours. There was always some drawing to finish, some music to copy, or some work to do, sufficient to incapacitate me from indulging in anything beyond a short walk about the grounds, however she or her sister might be occupied. One morning, having sought and waylaid Mr. Weston, they returned in high glee to give me an account of their interview.
"And he asked after you again?"
said Matilda, in spite of her sister's silent but imperative intimation that she should hold her tongue.
"He wondered why you were never with us, and thought you must have delicate health, as you came out so seldom."
He didn't, Matilda. What nonsense you're talking.
"Oh, Rosalie, what a lie! He did, you know. And you said, 'Don't, Rosalie! Hang it, I won't be pinched so.' And Miss Grey, Rosalie told him you were quite well, but you were always so buried in your books that you had no pleasure in anything else."
What an idea he must have of me, I thought. And, I asked, does old Nancy ever inquire about me?
"Yes, and we tell her you are so fond of reading and drawing that you can do nothing else."
That is not the case, though. If you had told her I was so busy I could not come to see her, it would have been nearer the truth,
I don't think it would,
replied Miss Murray, suddenly kindling up.
I'm sure you have plenty of time to yourself now, when you have so little teaching to do.
It was no use beginning to dispute with such indulged, unreasoning creatures, so I held my peace. I was accustomed now to keeping silence when things distasteful to my ear were uttered, and now too I was used to wearing a placid, smiling countenance when my heart was bitter within me. Only those who have felt the like can imagine my feelings, as I sat with an assumption of smiling indifference, listening to the accounts of those meetings and interviews with Mr. Weston, which they seemed to find such pleasure in describing to me, and hearing things asserted of him which, from the character of the man, I knew to be exaggerations and perversions of the truth, if not entirely false, things derogatory to him, and flattering to them, especially to Miss Murray, which I burned to contradict, or at least to show my doubts about, but dared not, lest, in expressing my disbelief, I should display my interest too. Other things I heard, which I felt or feared were indeed too true, but I must still conceal my anxiety respecting him, my indignation against them, beneath a careless aspect. Others, again, mere hints of something said or done which I longed to hear more of, but could not venture to inquire. So passed the weary time. I could not even comfort myself with saying, "She will soon be married, and then there may be hope." Soon after her marriage the holidays would come, and when I returned from home, most likely, Mr. Weston would be gone, for I was told that he and the rector could not agree, the rector's fault, of course, and he was about to remove to another place. No, besides my hope in God, my only consolation was in thinking that, though he knew it not, I was more worthy of his love than Rosalie Murray, charming and engaging as she was, for I could appreciate his excellence, which she could not. I would devote my life to the promotion of his happiness. She would destroy his happiness for the momentary gratification of her own vanity. Oh, if he could but know the difference! I would earnestly exclaim. But no, I would not have him see my heart. Yet, if he could but know her hollowness, her worthless, heartless frivolity, he would then be safe, and I should be almost happy, though I might never see him more. I fear by this time the reader is well nigh disgusted with the folly and weakness I have so freely laid before him. I never disclosed it then, and would not have done so had my own sister or my mother been with me in the house. I was a close and resolute dissembler, in this one case at least. My prayers, my tears, my wishes, fears, and lamentations were witnessed by myself and Heaven alone. When we are harassed by sorrows or anxieties, or long oppressed by any powerful feelings which we must keep to ourselves, for which we can obtain and seek no sympathy from any living creature, and which yet we cannot, or will not, wholly crush, we often naturally seek relief in poetry, and often find it too, whether in the effusion of others, which seem to harmonize with our existing case, or in our own attempts to give utterance to those thoughts and feelings in strains less musical, perchance, but more appropriate, and therefore more penetrating and sympathetic, and for the time more soothing, or more powerful to rouse and to unburden the oppressed and swollen heart. Before this time, at Wellwood House and here, when suffering from homesick melancholy, I had sought relief twice or thrice at this secret source of consolation, and now I flew to it again, with greater avidity than ever, because I seemed to need it more. I still preserve those relics of past sufferings and experience, like pillars of witness set up in travelling through the vale of life, to mark particular occurrences. The footsteps are obliterated now. The face of the country may be changed, but the pillar is still there, to remind me how all things were when it was reared. Lest the reader should be curious to see any of these effusions, I will favour him with one short specimen. Cold and languid as the lines may seem, it was almost a passion of grief to which they owed their being. Oh, they have robbed me of the hope my spirit held so dear. They will not let me hear that voice my soul delights to hear. They will not let me see that face I so delight to see, and they have taken all thy smiles, and all thy love from me. Well, let them seize on all they can. One treasure still is mine, a heart that loves to think on thee, and feels the worth of thine. Yes, at least they could not deprive me of that. I could think of him day and night, and I could feel that he was worthy to be thought of. Nobody knew him as I did. Nobody could appreciate him as I did. Nobody could love him as I could, if I might. But there was the evil. What business had I to think so much of one that never thought of me? Was it not foolish? Was it not wrong? Yet, if I found such deep delight in thinking of him, and if I kept those thoughts to myself, and troubled no one else with them, where was the harm of it? I would ask myself. And such reasoning prevented me from making any sufficient effort to shake off my fetters. But, if those thoughts brought delight, it was a painful, troubled pleasure, too near akin to anguish, and one that did me more injury than I was aware of. It was an indulgence that a person of more wisdom or more experience would doubtless have denied herself. And yet, how dreary to turn my eyes from the contemplation of that bright object, and force them to dwell on the dull, grey, desolate prospect around, the joyless, hopeless, solitary path that lay before me. It was wrong to be so joyless, so desponding. I should have made God my friend, and to do his will the pleasure and the business of my life. But faith was weak, and passion was too strong. In this time of trouble I had two other causes of affliction. The first may seem a trifle, but it cost me many a tear. Snap, my little dumb, rough-visaged, but bright-eyed, warm-hearted companion, the only thing I had to love me, was taken away, and delivered over to the tender mercies of the village rat-catcher, a man notorious for his brutal treatment of his canine slaves. The other was serious enough. My letters from home gave intimation that my father's health was worse. No boding fears were expressed, but I was grown timid and despondent, and could not help fearing that some dreadful calamity awaited us there. I seemed to see the black clouds gathering round my native hills, and to hear the angry muttering of a storm that was about to burst and desolate our hearth.
End of chapter 17. Of Agnes Grey by Anne Brontë. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 18. Mirth and Mourning.
The 1st of June arrived at last, and Rosalie Murray was transmuted into Lady Ashby. Most splendidly beautiful she looked in her bridal costume. Upon her return from church, after the ceremony, she came flying into the schoolroom, flushed with excitement, and laughing, half in mirth, and half in reckless desperation, as it seemed to me.
"Now, Miss Grey, I'm Lady Ashby,"
she exclaimed.
"It's done. My fate is sealed. There's no drawing back now. I'm come to receive your congratulations and bid you good-bye, and then I'm off for Paris, Rome, Naples, Switzerland, London. Oh dear, what a deal I shall see and hear before I come back again. But don't forget me. I shan't forget you, though I've been a naughty girl. Come, why don't you congratulate me?"
"I cannot congratulate you," I replied, "till I know whether this change is really for the better. But I sincerely hope it is, and I wish you true happiness and the best of blessings."
"Well, good-bye. The carriage is waiting, and they're calling me."
She gave me a hasty kiss, and was hurrying away, but suddenly returning, embraced me with more affection than I thought her capable of evincing, and departed with tears in her eyes. Poor girl! I really loved her then, and forgave her from my heart all the injury she had done me, and others also. She had not half known it, I was sure, and I prayed God to pardon her too. During the remainder of that day of festal sadness, I was left to my own devices. Being too much unhinged for any steady occupation, I wandered about with a book in my hand for several hours, more thinking than reading, for I had many things to think about. In the evening I made use of my liberty to go and see my old friend Nancy once again, to apologize for my long absence, which must have seemed so neglectful and unkind, by telling her how busy I had been, and to talk or read or work for her, whichever might be most acceptable, and also, of course, to tell her the news of this important day, and perhaps to obtain a little information from her in return respecting Mr. Weston's expected departure. But of this she seemed to know nothing, and I hoped, as she did, that it was all a false report. She was very glad to see me, but happily her eyes were now so nearly well that she was almost independent of my services. She was deeply interested in the wedding, but while I amused her with the details of the festive day, the splendours of the bridal party, and of the bride herself, she often sighed and shook her head, and wished good might come of it. She seemed, like me, to regard it rather as a theme for sorrow than rejoicing. I sat a long time talking to her about that and other things, but no one came. Shall I confess that I sometimes looked towards the door with a half-expectant wish to see it open, and give entrance to Mr. Weston, as had happened once before, and that, returning through the lanes and fields, I often paused to look round me, and walked more slowly than was at all necessary, for though a fine evening, it was not a hot one, and finally felt a sense of emptiness and disappointment at having reached the house without meeting or even catching a distant glimpse of any one, except a few labourers returning from their work. Sunday, however, was approaching. I should see him then, for now that Miss Murray was gone, I could have my old corner again. I should see him, and by look, speech, and manner, I might judge whether the circumstance of her marriage had very much afflicted him. Happily I could perceive no shadow of a difference. He wore the same aspect as he had worn 2 months ago. Voice, look, manner, all alike unchanged. There was the same keen-sighted, unclouded truthfulness in his discourse, the same forcible clearness in his style, the same earnest simplicity in all he said and did, that made itself not marked by the eye and ear, but felt upon the hearts of his audience. I walked home with Miss Matilda, but he did not join us. Matilda was now sadly at a loss for amusement, and woefully in want of a companion. Her brothers at school, her sister married and gone, she too young to be admitted into society, for which, from Rosalie's example, she was in some degree beginning to acquire a taste at least for the company of certain classes of gentlemen, at this dull time of year, no hunting going on, no shooting even, for though she might not join in that, it was something to see her father or the gamekeeper go out with the dogs, and to talk with them on their return about the different birds they had bagged. Now also she was denied the solace which the companionship of the coachman, grooms, horses, greyhounds, and pointers might have afforded, for her mother having, notwithstanding the disadvantages of a country life, so satisfactorily disposed of her elder daughter, the pride of her heart had begun seriously to turn her attention to the younger, and being truly alarmed at the roughness of her manners, and thinking it high time to work a reform, had been roused at length to exert her authority, and prohibited entirely the yards, stables, kennels, and coach-house. Of course she was not implicitly obeyed, but, indulgent as she had hitherto been, when once her spirit was roused, her temper was not so gentle as she required that of her governesses to be, and her will was not to be thwarted with impunity. After many a scene of contention between mother and daughter, many a violent outbreak which I was ashamed to witness, in which the father's authority was often called in to confirm with oaths and threats the mother's slighted prohibitions, for even he could see that
Tilly, though she would have made a fine lad, was not quite what a young lady ought to be.
Matilda at length found that her easiest plan was to keep clear of the forbidden regions, unless she could now and then steal a visit, without her watchful mother's knowledge. Amid all this, let it not be imagined that I escaped without many a reprimand, and many an implied reproach, that lost none of its sting from not being openly worded, but rather wounded the more deeply, because, from that very reason, it seemed to preclude self-defence. Frequently I was told to amuse Miss Matilda with other things, and to remind her of her mother's precepts and prohibitions. I did so to the best of my power, but she would not be amused against her will, and could not against her taste. And though I went beyond mere reminding, such gentle remonstrances as I could use were utterly ineffectual.
Dear Miss Grey, it is the strangest thing. I suppose you can't help it if it's not in your nature, but I wonder you can't win the confidence of that girl, and make your society at least as agreeable to her as that of Robert or Joseph.
They can talk the best about the things in which she is most interested, I replied.
Well, that is a strange confession, however, to come from her governess, Who is to form a young lady's tastes, I wonder, if the governess doesn't do it? I have known governesses who have so completely identified themselves with the reputation of their young ladies for elegance and propriety in mind and manners, that they would blush to speak a word against them, and to hear the slightest blame imputed to their pupils was worse than to be censured in their own persons. And I really think it very natural for my part.
Do you, ma'am?
Yes, of course. The young lady's proficiency and elegance is of more consequence to the governess than her own, as well as to the world. If she wishes to prosper in her vocation, she must devote all her energies to her business. All her ideas and all her ambition will tend to the accomplishment of that one object. When we wish to decide upon the merits of a governess, we naturally look at the young lady she professes to have educated, and judge accordingly. The judicious governess knows this. She knows that, while she lives in obscurity herself, her pupils' virtues and defects will be open to every eye, and that unless she loses sight of herself in their cultivation, she need not hope for success. You see, Miss Grey, it is just the same as any other trade or profession. They that wish to prosper must devote themselves body and soul to their calling, and if they begin to yield to indolence or self-indulgence, they are speedily distanced by wiser competitors. There is little to choose between a person that ruins her pupils by neglect, and one that corrupts them by her example. You will excuse my dropping these little hints. You know it is all for your own good. Many ladies would speak to you much more strongly, and many would not trouble themselves to speak at all, but quietly look out for a substitute. That, of course, would be the easiest plan, but I know the advantages of a place like this to a person in your situation, and I have no desire to part with you, as I am sure you would do very well if you will only think of these things and try to exert yourself a little more. Then I am convinced you would soon acquire that delicate tact which alone is wanting to give you a proper influence over the mind of your pupil.
I was about to give the lady some idea of the fallacy of her expectations, but she sailed away as soon as she had concluded her speech. Having said what she wished, it was no part of her plan to await my answer. It was my business to hear, and not to speak. However, as I have said, Matilda at length yielded in some degree to her mother's authority. Pity it had not been exerted before. And being thus deprived of almost every source of amusement, there was nothing for it but to take long rides with the groom, and long walks with the governess, and to visit the cottages and farmhouses on her father's estate, to kill time in chatting with the old men and women that inhabited them. In one of these walks it was our chance to meet Mr. Weston. This was what I had long desired, but now, for a moment, I wished either he or I were away. I felt my heart throb so violently that I dreaded lest some outward signs of emotion should appear. But I think he hardly glanced at me, and I was soon calm enough. After a brief salutation to both, he asked Matilda if she had lately heard from her sister.
Yes,
replied she.
She was at Paris when she wrote, and very well, and very happy.
She spoke the last word emphatically, and with a glance impertinently sly. He did not seem to notice it, but replied, with equal emphasis, and very seriously,
I hope she will continue to be so.
Do you think it likely? I ventured to inquire, for Matilda had started off in pursuit of her dog, that was chasing a leveret.
I cannot tell,
replied he.
Sir Thomas may be a better man than I suppose, but, from all I have heard and seen, it seems a pity that one so young and gay and interesting, to express many things by one word, whose greatest, if not her only fault, appears to be thoughtlessness. No trifling fault, to be sure, since it renders the possessor liable to almost every other, and exposes him to so many temptations. But it seems a pity that she should be thrown away on such a man. It was her mother's wish, I suppose.
Yes, and her own too, I think, for she always laughed at my attempts to dissuade her from the step.
You did attempt it? Then, at least, you will have the satisfaction of knowing that it is no fault of yours if any harm should come of it. As for Mrs. Murray, I don't know how she can justify her conduct. If I had sufficient acquaintance with her, I'd ask her.
It seems unnatural, but some people think rank and wealth the chief good, and if they can secure that for their children, they think they have done their duty.
True, but is it not strange that persons of experience, who have been married themselves, should judge so falsely?
Matilda now came panting back, with the lacerated body of the young hare in her hand.
Was it your intention to kill that hare, or to save it, Miss Murray?
Asked Mr. Weston, apparently puzzled at her gleeful countenance.
I pretended to want to save it,
She answered, honestly enough.
as it was so glaringly out of season, but I was better pleased to see it lulled. However, you can both witness that I couldn't help it. Prince was determined to have her, and he clutched her by the back and killed her in a minute. Wasn't it a noble chase?
Very, for a young lady after a leveret.
There was a quiet sarcasm in the tone of his reply, which was not lost upon her. She shrugged her shoulders, and turning away with a significant "Humph!" asked me how I had enjoyed the fun. I replied that I saw no fun in the matter, but admitted that I had not observed the transaction very narrowly.
Didn't you see how it doubled, just like an old hare? And didn't you hear it scream?
I'm happy to say I did not.
It cried out just like a child.
Poor little thing! What will you do with it?
Come along. I shall leave it in the first house we come to. I don't want to take it home, for fear papa should scold me for letting the dog kill it.
Mr. Weston was now gone, and we too went on our way. But as we returned, after having deposited the hare in a farmhouse, and demolished some spice cake and currant wine in exchange, we met him returning also from the execution of his mission, whatever it might be. He carried in his hand a cluster of beautiful bluebells, which he offered to me, observing, with a smile, that though he had seen so little of me for the last 2 months, he had not forgotten that bluebells were numbered among my favourite flowers. It was done as a simple act of good-will, without compliment or remarkable courtesy, or any look that could be construed into reverential, tender adoration, vide Rosalie Murray. But still it was something to find my unimportant sayings so well remembered. It was something that he had noticed so accurately the time I had ceased to be visible.
I was told,
said he,
that you were a perfect bookworm, Miss Grey, so completely absorbed in your studies that you were lost to every other pleasure.
Yes, and it's quite true,
cried Matilda. No, Mr. Weston, don't believe it. It's a scandalous libel. These young ladies are too fond of making random assertions at the expense of their friends, and you ought to be careful how you listen to them.
I hope this assertion is groundless, at any rate.
Why? Do you particularly object to ladies studying?
No, but I object to anyone so devoting himself or herself to study as to lose sight of everything else. Except under peculiar circumstances, I consider very close and constant study as a waste of time and an injury to the mind as well as the body.
Well, I have neither the time nor the inclination for such transgressions. We parted again. Well, what is there remarkable in all this? Why have I recorded it? Because, reader, it was important enough to give me a cheerful evening, a night of pleasing dreams, and a morning of felicitous hopes. Shallow-brained cheerfulness, foolish dreams, unfounded hopes, you would say. And I will not venture to deny it. Suspicions to that effect arose too frequently in my own mind. But our wishes are like tinder. The flint and steel of circumstances are continually striking out sparks, which vanish immediately, unless they chance to fall upon the tinder of our wishes. Then they instantly ignite, and the flame of hope is kindled in a moment. But alas, that very morning my flickering flame of hope was dismally quenched by a letter from my mother, which spoke so seriously of my father's increasing illness, that I feared there was little or no chance of his recovery, and close at hand as the holidays were, I almost trembled lest they should come too late for me to meet him in this world. 2 days after, a letter from Mary told me his life was despaired of, and his end seemed fast approaching. Then immediately I sought permission to anticipate the vacation, and go without delay. Mrs. Murray stared, and wondered at the unwonted energy and boldness with which I urged the request, and thought there was no occasion to hurry, but finally gave me leave, stating, however, that there was no need to be in such agitation about the matter. It might prove a false alarm after all, and if not, why it was only in the common course of nature. We must all die some time, and I was not to suppose myself the only afflicted person in the world, and concluding with saying I might have the phaeton to take me to O.
And instead of repining, Miss Grey, be thankful for the privileges you enjoy. There's many a poor clergyman whose family would be plunged into ruin by the event of his death. But you see, have influential friends ready to continue their patronage, and to show you every consideration.
I thanked her for her consideration, and flew to my room to make some hurried preparations for my departure. My bonnet and shawl being on, and a few things hastily crammed into my largest trunk, I descended. But I might have done the work more leisurely, for no one else was in a hurry, and I had still a considerable time to wait for the phaeton. At length it came to the door, and I was off. But oh, what a dreary journey was that! How utterly different from my former passages homewards! Being too late for the last coach, too, I had to hire a cab for 10 miles, and then a car to take me over the rugged hills. It was 10:30 before I reached home. They were not in bed. My mother and sister both met me in the passage, sad, silent, pale. I was so much shocked and terror-stricken that I could not speak, to ask the information I so much longed, yet dreaded to obtain.
"Agnes,"
said my mother, struggling to repress some strong emotion.
"Oh, Agnes,"
cried Mary, and burst into tears. "How is he?" I asked, gasping for the answer.
"Dead."
It was the reply I had anticipated, but the shock seemed none the less tremendous.
End of chapter 18. Of Agnes Grey by Anne Brontë. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 19. The Letter.
My father's mortal remains had been consigned to the tomb, and we, with sad faces, in sombre garments, sat lingering over the frugal breakfast table, revolving plans for our future life. My mother's strong mind had not given way beneath even this affliction. Her spirit, though crushed, was not broken. Mary's wish was that I should go back to Horton Lodge, and that our mother should come and live with her and Mr. Richardson at the vicarage. She affirmed that he wished it no less than herself, and that such an arrangement could not fail to benefit all parties, for my mother's society and experience would be of inestimable value to them, and they would do all they could to make her happy. But no arguments or entreaties could prevail. My mother was determined not to go. Not that she questioned, for a moment, the kind wishes and intentions of her daughter, but she affirmed that so long as God spared her health and strength, she would make use of them to earn her own livelihood, and be chargeable to no one, whether her dependence would be felt as a burden or not. If she could afford to reside as a lodger in vicarage, she would choose that house before all others as the place of her abode, but not being so circumstanced, she would never come under its roof, except as an occasional visitor, unless sickness or calamity should render her assistance really needful, or until age or infirmity made her incapable of maintaining herself.
"No, Mary,"
said she,
"if Richardson and you have anything to spare, you must lay it aside for your family, and Agnes and I must gather honey for ourselves. Thanks to my having had daughters to educate, I have not forgotten my accomplishments. God willing, I will check this vain repining,"
she said, while the tears coursed one another down her cheeks in spite of her efforts. But she wiped them away, and resolutely shaking back her head, continued,
"I will exert myself, and look out for a small house, commodiously situated in some populous but healthy district, where we will take a few young ladies to board and educate, if we can get them, and as many day pupils as will come, or as we can manage to instruct. Your father's relations and old friends will be able to send us some pupils, or to assist us with their recommendations, no doubt. I shall not apply to my own. What say you to it, Agnes? Will you be willing to leave your present situation and try?"
"Quite willing, mamma, and the money I have saved will do to furnish the house. It shall be taken from the bank directly."
"When it is wanted. We must get the house, and settle on preliminaries first."
Mary offered to lend the little she possessed, but my mother declined it, saying that we must begin on an economical plan, and she hoped that the whole or part of mine, added to what we could get by the sale of the furniture, and what little our dear papa had contrived to lay aside for her since the debts were paid, would be sufficient to last us till Christmas, when, it was hoped, something would accrue from our united labours. It was finally settled that this should be our plan, and that inquiries and preparation should immediately be set on foot. And while my mother busied herself with these, I should return to Horton Lodge at the close of my 4 weeks' vacation, and give notice for my final departure when things were in train for the speedy commencement of our school. We were discussing these affairs on the morning I have mentioned, about a fortnight after my father's death, when a letter was brought in for my mother, on beholding which the colour mounted to her face, lately pale enough with anxious watchings and excessive sorrow.
"From my father?"
murmured she, as she hastily tore off the cover. It was many years since she had heard from any of her own relations before. Naturally wondering what the letter might contain, I watched her countenance while she read it, and was somewhat surprised to see her bite her lip and knit her brows as if in anger. When she had done, she somewhat irreverently cast it on the table, saying with a scornful smile,
"Your grandpapa has been so kind as to write to me. He says he has no doubt I have long repented of my unfortunate marriage, and if I will only acknowledge this, and confess I was wrong in neglecting his advice, and that I have justly suffered for it, he will make a lady of me once again, if that be possible after my long degradation, and remember my girls in his will. Get my desk, Agnes, and send these things away. I will answer the letter directly. But first, as I may be depriving you both of a legacy, it is just that I should tell you what I mean to say. I shall say that he is mistaken in supposing that I can regret the birth of my daughters, who have been the pride of my life, and are likely to be the comfort of my old age, or the 30 years I have passed in the company of my best and dearest friend, that, had our misfortunes been 3 times as great as they were, unless they had been of my bringing on, I should still the more rejoice to have shared them with your father, and administered what consolation I was able, and, had his sufferings in illness been 10 times what they were, I could not regret having watched over and laboured to relieve them, that if he had married a richer wife, misfortunes and trials would no doubt have come upon him still, while I am egoist enough to imagine that no other woman could have cheered him through them so well. Not that I am superior to the rest, but I was made for him, and he for me, and I can no more repent the hours, days, years of happiness we have spent together, and which neither could have had without the other, than I can the privilege of having been his nurse in sickness, and his comfort in affliction. Will this do, children? Or shall I say we are all very sorry for what has happened during the last 30 years, and my daughters wish they had never been born, but since they have had that misfortune, they will be thankful for any trifle their grandpapa will be kind enough to bestow?"
Of course, we both applauded our mother's resolution. Mary cleared away the breakfast things, I brought the desk, the letter was quickly written and dispatched, and from that day we heard no more of our grandfather, till we saw his death announced in the newspaper a considerable time after, all his worldly possessions, of course, being left to our wealthy unknown cousins.
End of chapter 19. Of Agnes Grey by Anne Brontë. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 20. The Farewell.
A house in A, the fashionable watering place, was hired for our seminary, and a promise of 2 or 3 pupils was obtained to commence with. I returned to Horton Lodge about the middle of July, leaving my mother to conclude the bargain for the house, to obtain more pupils, to sell off the furniture of our old abode, and to fit out the new one. We often pity the poor, because they have no leisure to mourn their departed relatives, and necessity obliges them to labour through their severest afflictions. But is not active employment the best remedy for overwhelming sorrow, the surest antidote for despair? It may be a rough comforter, it may seem hard to be harassed with the cares of life when we have no relish for its enjoyments, to be goaded to labour when the heart is ready to break, and the vexed spirit implores for rest, only to weep in silence. But is not labour better than the rest we covet? And are not these petty tormenting cares less hurtful than a continual brooding over the great affliction that oppresses us? Besides, we cannot have cares, and anxieties, and toil, without hope, and if it be but the hope of fulfilling our joyless task, accomplishing some needful project, or escaping some further annoyance. At any rate, I was glad my mother had so much employment for every faculty of her action-loving frame. Our kind neighbours lamented that she, once so exalted in wealth and station, should be reduced to such extremity in her time of sorrow, but I am persuaded that she would have suffered thrice as much had she been left in affluence, with liberty to remain in that house, the scene of her early happiness and late affliction, and no stern necessity to prevent her from incessantly brooding over and lamenting her bereavement. I will not dilate upon the feelings with which I left the old house, the well-known garden, the little village church, then doubly dear to me, because my father, who, for 30 years, had taught and prayed within its walls, lay slumbering now beneath its flags, and the old bare hills, delightful in their very desolation, with the narrow vales between, smiling in green wood and sparkling water, the house where I was born, the scene of all my early associations, the place where throughout life my earthly affections had been centred, and left them to return no more. True, I was going back to Horton Lodge, where, amid many evils, one source of pleasure yet remained, but it was pleasure mingled with excessive pain, and my stay, alas, was limited to 6 weeks, and even of that precious time, day after day slipped by, and I did not see him, except at church. I never saw him for a fortnight after my return. It seemed a long time to me, and as I was often out with my rambling pupil, of course hopes would keep rising, and disappointments would ensue, and then I would say to my own heart, here is a convincing proof, if you would but have the sense to see it, or the candour to acknowledge it, that he does not care for you. If he only thought half as much about you as you do about him, he would have contrived to meet you many times ere this. You must know that, by consulting your own feelings. Therefore, have done with this nonsense. You have no ground for hope. Dismiss at once these hurtful thoughts and foolish wishes from your mind, and turn to your own duty, and the dull blank life that lies before you. You might have known such happiness was not for you. But I saw him at last. He came suddenly upon me as I was crossing a field and returning from a visit to Nancy Brown, which I had taken the opportunity of paying while Matilda Murray was riding her matchless mare. He must have heard of the heavy loss I had sustained. He expressed no sympathy, offered no condolence, but almost the first words he uttered were,
"How is your mother?"
And this was no matter of course question, for I never told him that I had a mother. He must have learned the fact from others, if he knew it at all. And besides, there was sincere good-will, and even deep, touching, unobtrusive sympathy in the tone and manner of the inquiry. I thanked him with due civility, and told him she was as well as could be expected.
"What will she do?"
was the next question. Many would have deemed it an impertinent one, and given an evasive reply, but such an idea never entered my head, and I gave a brief but plain statement of my mother's plans and prospects.
"Then you will leave this place shortly?"
said he. "Yes, in a month." He paused a minute, as if in thought. When he spoke again, I hoped it would be to express his concern at my departure, but it was only to say,
"I should think you will be willing enough to go."
"Yes, for some things," I replied.
"For some things only? I wonder what should make you regret it."
I was annoyed at this in some degree, because it embarrassed me. I had only one reason for regretting it, and that was a profound secret which he had no business to trouble me about. "Why," said I, "why should you suppose that I dislike the place?"
"You told me so yourself,"
was the decisive reply.
"You said, at least, that you could not live contentedly without a friend, and that you had no friend here, and no possibility of making one. And besides, I know you must dislike it."
"But if you remember rightly, I said, or meant to say, I could not live contentedly without a friend in the world. I was not so unreasonable as to require one always near me. I think I could be happy in a house full of enemies, if— But no, that sentence must not be continued. I paused and hastily added, "And besides, we cannot well leave a place where we have lived for 2 or 3 years without some feeling of regret."
"Will you regret to part with Miss Murray, your sole remaining pupil and companion?"
"I dare say I shall in some degree. It was not without sorrow I parted with her sister."
"I can imagine that."
"Well, Miss Matilda is quite as good. Better, in one respect."
"What is that?"
"She's honest."
"And the other is not?"
"I should not call her dishonest, but it must be confessed she's a little artful."
"Artful, is she? I saw she was giddy and vain, and now,"
he added, after a pause,
"I can well believe she was artful too, but so excessively so as to assume an aspect of extreme simplicity and unguarded openness. Yes,"
continued he, musingly,
"that accounts for some little things that puzzled me a trifle before."
After that, he turned the conversation to more general subjects. He did not leave me till we had nearly reached the park gates. He had certainly stepped a little out of his way to accompany me so far, for he now went back and disappeared down Moss Lane, the entrance of which we had passed some time before. Assuredly I did not regret this circumstance. If sorrow had any place in my heart, it was that he was gone at last, that he was no longer walking by my side, and that that short interval of delightful intercourse was at an end. He had not breathed a word of love, or dropped one hint of tenderness or affection, and yet I had been supremely happy. To be near him, to hear him talk as he did talk, and to feel that he thought me worthy to be so spoken to, capable of understanding and duly appreciating such discourse, was enough. Yes, Edward Weston, I could indeed be happy in a house full of enemies, if I had but one friend, who truly, deeply, and faithfully loved me, and if that friend were you, though we might be far apart, seldom to hear from each other, still more seldom to meet, though toil and trouble and vexation might surround me, still it would be too much happiness for me to dream of. Yet who can tell, said I within myself, as I proceeded up the park, who can tell what this 1 month may bring forth? I have lived nearly 23 years, and I have suffered much, and tasted little pleasure yet. Is it likely my life all through will be so clouded? Is it not possible that God may hear my prayers, disperse these gloomy shadows, and grant me some beams of heaven's sunshine yet? Will he entirely deny to me those blessings which are so freely given to others, who neither ask them nor acknowledge them when received? May I not still hope and trust? I did hope and trust for a while, but alas, alas, the time ebbed away. 1 week followed another, and excepting one distant glimpse and 2 transient meetings, during which scarcely anything was said, while I was walking with Miss Matilda, I saw nothing of him, except, of course, at church. And now the last Sunday was come, and the last service. I was often on the point of melting into tears during the sermon. The last I was to hear from him, the best I should hear from any one, I was well assured. It was over. The congregation were departing, and I must follow. I had then seen him, and heard his voice too, probably, for the last time. In the churchyard, Matilda was pounced upon by the 2 Misses Green. They had many inquiries to make about her sister, and I knew not what besides. I only wished they would have done, that we might hasten back to Horton Lodge. I longed to seek the retirement of my own room, or some sequestered nook in the grounds, that I might deliver myself up to my feelings, to weep my last farewell, and lament my false hopes and vain delusions. Only this once, and then adieu to fruitless dreaming. Thenceforth only sober, solid, sad reality should occupy my mind. But while I thus resolved, a low voice close beside me said,
"I suppose you are going this week, Miss Grey?"
"Yes," I replied. I was very much startled, and had I been at all hysterically inclined, I certainly should have committed myself in some way then. Thank God I was not.
"Well,"
said Mr. Weston,
"I want to bid you good-bye. It is not likely I shall see you again before you go."
"Good-bye, Mr. Weston," I said. Oh, how I struggled to say it calmly. I gave him my hand. He retained it a few seconds in his.
"It is possible we may meet again,"
said he.
"Will it be of any consequence to you whether we do or not?"
"Yes, I should be very glad to see you again." I could say no less. He kindly pressed my hand, and went. Now I was happy again, though more inclined to burst into tears than ever. If I had been forced to speak at that moment, a succession of sobs would have inevitably ensued, and as it was, I could not keep the water out of my eyes. I walked along with Miss Murray, turning aside my face, and neglecting to notice several successive remarks, till she bawled out that I was either deaf or stupid, and then, having recovered my self-possession, as one awakened from a fit of abstraction, I suddenly looked up and asked what she had been saying.
End of chapter 20.